All right. Hello, everybody. We're going to talk about measurement and testing in behavioral sciences today. Um, so really we're talking about conceptual research. Um, it's a heady topic, so be with me. Watch the videos a couple times. I leave a lot of additional resources embedded in the slides throughout the way. I will try to point out as we go. But let's just start with the top of what is conceptual research and what does that even literally mean? It's one of those things that people tend to think they understand, but once we start really breaking down the concepts involved, are like, whoa, okay, that's actually much more complicated than I thought. At least that's how I feel about it. So we'll start at the top. A concept. What even is a concept? How are we defining that? A concept are defined as units of knowledge built from characteristics. So it can be an abstract idea or mental symbol that forms our cognitive structure or understanding of a thing. It's a complex idea formed by combining simpler concepts. So a concept is a particular understanding or unit of understanding. A concept is some sort of abstract or mental understanding of a thing rather than the physical existence of it. So my concept of a dog is built off of all my interactions with dogs, but that doesn't mean the dog itself is a concept. A concept is my mental understanding of it rather than the lived reality of the thing. Concepts. It's part of why communication is so hard, because we all have our own concepts and we don't always recognize that very well. Conceptualization then is the process of defining what we actually mean when we're talking about that concept, the process of defining that specific term. And that is really, really important when we talk about research. Clarifying what it means for research purposes determines how we measure that concept. So I'm going to use the example of a dog, right? I have a concept of a dog, but if I am going to study dogs, I'm going to have to really refine my conceptualization because are all dogs the same? No. Are little dogs the same as big dogs? No. Big dogs are nicer and calmer and tend to be less sassy. Little dogs give you an opinion. Little dogs have personality. Little dogs are yappers, right? Not all the time, not all the time, but in general, that is my concept of them. So if I'm going to do research about dogs, maybe I'm looking at emotional intelligence in dogs. I got to really define what I mean by a dog. What am I at? What is the concept am I actually looking at? Am I looking at all dogs? Am I looking at just golden retrievers? If I'm looking at golden retrievers, am I just looking at purebreds or am I looking at mixes? We got to really define that concept a lot better than we do in day-to-day conversation a lot of the time. Concepts are the actual understanding. Conceptualization is the process of defining what that concept is. A little bit different, but inform each other. And the reality of it is that concepts only exist on our agreed upon communication of that thing. So they are products of the conceptualization process, but more often than not, all of the concept, not all, a really good part of conceptualization happens internally without us consciously thinking about it. So then we get frustrated sometimes when we're talking to someone and their concept of the thing is not the same as our concept of the thing. I'll pick on myself. My dad and I got in a fight with me yesterday about what counts as being disrespectful, for example, right? So my concept of disrespectful is that it is a blatant and intentional disregard for someone else, particularly like their feelings or how you're coming across. That's disrespectful. My dad thinks that disrespectful is disagreeing with someone. We have different concepts of what that word means. So when we're fighting, we're usually very literally not talking about the same things. And it's a lot of what arguments tends to be. I did a lot of couples therapy, like I am a couples therapist in a lot of spaces. And a lot of the work we do in couples therapy is trying to have people conceptualize things together so we can decide what we are actually talking about before we get to the so what of it. Actually, a really big idea. There's also something to be really aware of, and you want to be aware of retification. That or reification. I apologize. I think I just pronounced that incorrectly. Reification. And this is when you think of something as abstract as a physical thing. So if I am thinking of happiness, if I'm a researcher and I want to study happiness, how happy does having a dog make you? I need to be really careful not to think of happiness as a literal physical thing that can be had, because it's not, right? So this gets us in trouble mentally a lot of the times too. Reification, the idea of treating something as a physical thing, even when it's not, we call it the hedonistic treadmill in therapy. And another way of saying that is it's really, 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 really common for people to say that their goal in life is to be happy. Some of you probably feel that way, right? I'm gonna pause for that. Is your goal in life to be happy? Because if it is, that's reification. That is not something that is achievable. That is not a physical thing that you get. You do not get happiness. It is abstract. It is in our head. It is a feeling. It is not a thing that can be achieved. So if you spend your whole life trying to be happy, but you don't have a really strong conceptualization of what it means to be happy, you will always feel like, why can't I just be happy? And well, it's because we haven't really conceptualized what that is. It's not something you can have. It's not a literal thing that you acquire. It is not money. It is not a car. It is not a house. It is not a spouse. It is not children. That is not going to get you happiness, because happiness is not a thing to be had. So we have to sit on our conceptualization. How do I know if I'm happy? Do I feel happy? Thank God you don't feel feelings forever. Feelings are fleeting. Feelings happen and then go away. Sometimes they stay with us for a while, but they happen and go away. So happiness is something that I know I unpack a lot with clients, and the idea of that is not an actual physical thing you can get. We have to really sit and decide what that means for you. It causes us a lot of problems if we don't consciously think about that. Okay, so that being said, there are two main classes of scientific measurement. So we have direct observables. These are clear, straightforward measurements. I can measure if something is a golden retriever or not. Well, I have to decide I'm purebred or not, but whatever. That is something I could theoretically conceptualize to the point that I can directly observe that. Is there, is it not? Indirect measurables are things that require more interpretation. Things like happiness. How do I measure how happy something makes someone? Things like if you've ever been in pain and you've gone to a doctor and they say on a 0 to 10 scale, 0 being no pain and 10 being the worst pain imaginable, what kind of pain are you in? That is an indirect observable. We cannot measure that. It is not an observable thing that we can measure. So we have to come up with other ways to do that, right? All right. So welcome. Conceptualizing research and conceptual research gets more complicated. I give another little definition of conceptualization, even though we just talked about it, just because I want to be able to contrast it when we're talking about operationalization. So conceptualizing something, conceptualization process is defining the concept. Operationalizing something is making that concept measurable. So we have to conceptualize something before we can operationalize it. When I say you need to operationalize that, when I'm responding to your research questions and saying, all right, next step is you got to operationalize it, usually what I mean is we have to figure out how you're going to study that. So if we're going to study something like aggression, first step is conceptualizing, okay, so we're deciding the concept of aggression means physical and verbal behaviors that are intending to harm someone. So not accidentally, intending to harm someone. That's how we are conceptualizing that for this research purpose. Then we're going to have to decide how to measure that. So we're going to have to operationalize it. How do you measure aggression? So this example, we're going to measure aggression through the frequency of reported hostile interactions or physiological responses to provocation. So how many times does someone consciously know that they are experiencing or enacting hostility, and how does that feel in their body? That's how we're going to operationalize that for this particular example. Part of what makes it tricky, though, is that people operationalize things differently. Research operationalizes things differently. Maybe I am looking at aggression, but I'm looking at aggression in dogs. Now, how in the hell am I going to get frequency of reported hostile interactions or physiological responses if I can't talk to that dog, right? So maybe instead we have to do frequency of observed hostile interactions, or we have to test the dog and keep a thermometer on them to see if they're getting higher blood temperature, or we have to have some sort of monitor on them so we can track if their heart is beating faster, meaning they're physiologically aroused, and we interpret that as aggression if it's paired with aggressive behaviors. We have to define what aggressive behaviors are in dogs. How do you know that? How do you look at it? How do you measure it? It's going to be different depending on your research question, how you're trying to research it. Operationalizing is an incredibly important part of behavioral science research for that reason. It's also part of how I want you to be suspicious of research when you're looking at something and the catchy title is eating bananas make people happier. I want you to go in and I want you to look at the research, and I want you to see how they conceptualize happiness. What does that literally mean? And how did they measure that? How did they measure that? Because a lot of times it's not like good. And so you can be suspicious of findings if you start to understand what conceptualization is, what operationalization is. Really important. It's very practical. We have to do that in order to do good research and to develop methods and instruments to be able to measure these things. Implications for research, I feel like I already talked about. There is a little video here that's going to break it down another way and give some other examples too, if that might be helpful to you. Okay. Indicators and dimensions in conceptual research. So indicators serve as a tangible marker to identify the presence of abstract concepts. So this can be a behavioral cue, a response on a survey. We asked someone and this is what they said. Oops. Just put that down there. Forget about it for right now. I'm not sure if you guys can see what just popped up on my screen. Sorry if you can, but here we are. All right. Indicators, tangible markers that we use to measure something. An example is in a study on stress, increased heart rate can be an indicator. Another one is cortisol. Cortisol levels can be an indicator of something like stress. Indicator is a physical, literal thing we can identify, collect, measure, and understand. Dimensions are specific measurable elements of a broader concept. So this is more multifaceted. It is more complex in construct. So an example would be a dimension of religiosity. What does it mean? If I want to look at how religious people are in the South, what does that mean? There's usually a lot of dimensions of it. There's usually a lot of really complex parts of that. So for religiosity, this might include things like someone's self-reported belief, someone's actual practice of that religion, someone's knowledge about that religion, or someone's internal or exterior experience of that religion or that religious community. And you can think, if I want to operationalize that, there's going to be a lot of stuff to measure there. How do you study someone's belief of religiosity? How do you study practice? Does that mean praying? Does that mean praying in a particular format? Does that mean going to a religious ceremony of some kind? On what frequency? What does knowledge mean? How do you test knowledge? Are we going to give someone, if I'm touching religiosity, Christian religiosity in the South, am I going to give someone a test about the Bible to see their knowledge, or are we focused more on the values? All those pieces of it, there's a lot of operationalization that has to go into that, because that concept is really complex and there's a lot of dimensions of it. So more often than not, a construct will have a lot of dimensions, and then some of those things will have indicators to measure, and some of them will have to get a little more creative. How do these things feed together? So a really robust concept usually has several indicators that align with any particular dimension of that concept, and consistent indicators across dimensions strengthen the validity of the concept's measurement. So the more the different indicators can be compared to each other, the more it means. So if we have consistent indicators across dimension, let's talk about religion. So maybe our indicators, we end up going by survey response. So I'm going to literally give them a survey, and it's a 0 to 10 with how much they think, how strong their beliefs are. Maybe I look at strength of beliefs. If I then also ask about strength of practice and strength in knowledge and strength found in experience, now it makes more sense because all those indicators are about strength throughout all those different dimensions. So it means more than if I ask about belief being strength and practice being regular like frequency and knowledge being a literal test, and experience being self-reported, how many times you've experienced community. All those different indicators on those different dimensions just means the dimensions can't like speak to each other as well. So you have to think about that kind of stuff when you design research. Let's see, case example. So considering job satisfaction, which has a whole lot of dimensions, if you think about what it means to be satisfied at work, this can be things like engagement, it can be how much you get paid, it can be your work-life balance, it can be how much you have opportunities to grow in a company. There can be a lot of dimensions of job satisfaction. And indicators of these dimensions could be attendance records. How often does someone go to work? How much are they on time? How much do they miss? Salary contentment surveys. So we could ask people every 6 months at a company how satisfied they are with their salary, given how much they work. Leave frequency, promotions, respectively. There could be a whole lot of different indicators for each of those different dimensions of interest within that concept. So you see how it gets complicated real quick. Behavioral science research is hard, y'all. And this is where a lot of the messiness lives, is just literally defining what it is we're talking about and how in the hell we're going to measure it. So measurement. Let's talk about measurement. How do we do this? I just think this is goofy. I just think it's fun. I don't know. Measurement. Measurement is a very ruled, meaning there's a lot of rules involved, process of assigning numbers or labels to attributes that represent some sort of characteristic of an individual or of a concept. So a measurement is quantifying things like traits, behaviors, and outcomes so that we can make sense of it and analyze it and compare it. So this is, when I say quantify, I mean something is represented by a number. When I'm quantifying pain, I might ask you 0 to 10, what's your pain at? 10 being the worst pain imaginable. That is me quantifying it so that I can measure it. Now, everything does not have to be quantified. That's where we get qualitative research. That's not the focus of what we're talking about today, but all of that to say, measurement is when we're turning something into a quantifiable expression of that experience or characteristic, trait, behavior. It's transforming an abstract concept into a quantifiable piece of data. Psychometrics is the science of psychological measurement. So there are people, my dissertation chair does psychometrics, and it's really important. Pass for me though, on a personal note, but psychometrics is the study of how we measure these things. There are people who specialize in the mathematics behind it. There are people who specialize in the exact construction of the measure, the exact construction of the scale we use to ask about happiness, making sure that it's valid, reliable. We'll talk about all of those. But psychometrics is that whole science of studying the measurement. It's focused on creating measurements, on making sure that they actually measure what we think they're measuring, on making sure they are appropriate for different groups of people. So how one group of person defines happiness might not be how another group defines happiness. So we got to ask those questions different ways, and we need to find ways to make sure we are actually capturing the information we think we're capturing. We'll talk about that throughout. But psychometrics, really interested in making sure that our measurements are good and solid. And it's really important because without really solid measurements, you don't have very good research. If we're not able to make sure you're actually studying what you think you're studying, or if it's not getting the same results when you use the same measurement, it's kind of crap science, and it isn't very generalizable. It doesn't mean much to the overall population. We talked about this when we talked about participant sampling and what generalizability is, but a lot of that comes back to psychometrics as well. If you have a really good measurement, it means people are more likely to be able to replicate that study and compare it between different studies of different people or different groups or different contexts. And it helps us actually understand the experience we are trying to measure and research. There are 3 primary ways of measurement within behavioral science, well, just in science in general, really. So the first one is self-report measures. This is where a lot of behavioral science lives. So we ask people and then they tell us what they think. So questionnaires, surveys, pieces of paper people ask you to fill out information on, that is self-report measures. And this can also be qualitative. I'm mostly talking about quantitative, some numbers today. But if I am sitting down and just talking to someone, and then I take the literal transcription of what was said, and then I look for themes and everything, that's qualitative research. But self-report, all of that is included in self-report. A behavioral measure is an observation or recording of a enacted actual behavior in a controlled or natural setting. So behavioral measurement is not us asking someone, how did you behave? That's self-report. If I ask someone how let me just back up. Behavioral measures can be literally watching someone and counting those behaviors or observing those behaviors. It could also be a recording of those behaviors in some way. So that might be a self-report behavioral measure. It can be both in that way. Yeah. Physiological measure is the use of technology to record physiological responses such as heart rate, brain activity, and indicators of psychological activity. So when we talk about things like neuroscience, or I was just talking about the dog and cortisol, anything that's like a physical marker that we're using to be an indicator of an experience, that's a physiological measure. So if I'm looking at someone's stress levels, and maybe I use both, maybe I ask them how they feel, that's self-report. Maybe I observe them while they are doing something stressful, and I look for things like fidgeting, things like touching their hair, things like touching their face. I have all these operationalized, here's what a behavioral expression of stress is, and then I count them. That's a behavioral measure. And a physiological measure would be the heart rate and cortisol levels, for example. This is a really nice little video. Let me see how long it is though.
How do we know that a survey or a measure is capturing what we want it to capture? Hi, I'm Evan, this is Black Academics, and today we're talking about psychometrics. Psychometrics is a field interested in how do we operationalize and quantify psychological constructs. So, for example, depression or intelligence or neuroticism, how do we know someone has that, and how do we know that they have more or less than maybe someone else or the general population? Psychometrics is related and relies on data theory, statistics, biostatistics, mathematical theory, mathematical sociology, and mathematical psychology. Basically, it's the science of making measurements that we can use for social phenomenon and psychological phenomenon. There are a lot of factors that go into a good measurement system. But generally, good measures are both accurate and precise. Precision refers to the ability of the measure to give the same result to the same situation or context multiple times. This is also called reproducibility or repeatability. So if I took a precise measure 5 times, those 5 answers that I get should be basically the same. There's very little variability. A measure's accuracy indicates how close does it get to some true value. It's also called validity. Like if the measure is accurate, then we can take it to mean that it is true or valid or makes sense. So you want a measurement to not only be accurate, as in tell you something fundamentally true, you also want it to be precise and give you reliable repeating data. For example, both rulers and laser measurements are valid or accurate ways to get someone's height. However, the laser is more precise. The problem is that when the concept we're trying to measure doesn't really have like a known truth. We prescribe social values to intelligence. It's not something that we inherently know, which means that IQ tests can be valid or precise and also measure something that's a proxy to intelligence, especially because IQ tests were made as eugenics. The fact that IQ tests are still so heavily correlated with socioeconomic status, education, race, ethnicity, language barriers suggests that it doesn't indicate some baseline cognitive functions, but rather the degree to which you are encultured into Western ideologies.
So I love this video for several different reasons. First off, I love this creator. I really do recommend if you are interested in this sort of stuff. He has all sorts of really digestible, awesome ways of explaining pretty complex things. So there's that. And second, I'm going to be talking about IQ tests as we kind of go today because I don't have the space or like formal reason in this class to talk about why IQ tests are garbage. But it is something I do specialize in and something I teach regularly. So I like that I kind of sneak that in there with him. 'Cause there's a lot of flaws with that. We'll talk about it as we go. So, okay,
How do we know that?
let's keep trucking. Whew. Levels of measurement. So levels of measurement refers to the type of data that variables represent and the mathematical operations that can meaningfully be performed on them in statistical analysis. Another way of saying that is levels of measurement refers to how we are measuring something, how we are understanding what the variables mean within that measurement, and then that the way of measuring it, the level of measurement informs what kind of statistics you can do with it. So I'm not going to hold you accountable. I'm not going to make you run statistics. That is a different class. That is a whole different ballpark, but I do want you to know what statistical tests are associated with each of these different levels of measurement. That's all I'm going to hold you accountable for though. So let's start at the top. Nominal levels. Nominal levels are categories without any numerical significance. So that means that while we are maybe putting a number to them so that we can interpret it, in and of itself, there aren't numbers involved. So gender is a good example of that. I'm going to really simply describe gender here, but let's say I am doing a survey and I'm interested in something that requires us knowing about gender. Maybe I'm looking at levels of aggression in dogs, okay? And I want to look at gender. And so I say that there are male dogs, female dogs, and those are my two binary genders for dogs. I might assign the numbers 1 to male and 2 to female so that when I'm looking at my statistics, I can divide those groups in that meaningful way. But the gender itself isn't a number. It isn't a number. We're just turning it into that. Same with an ethnicity, right? There's a bazillion ethnicities. Ethnicity is where your family of origin and cultural influences come from. That's different than race. That's a different conversation. But ethnicity, there is no numbers inherent to them. So if I'm asking participants' ethnicities, I might assign Black to the number 1 and Latino to number 2 and Native Hawaiian to number 3 and white to number 4 and multiracial to 5. And we can assign those things to numbers, but they do not actually have a numerical significance other than it's the way we can turn it into statistics and make sense of those groups. So the statistics involved with that are things like mode. So throw back to mean, median, mode, right? Mean is the literal, I add them all together. Here's the average. Median is what occurs the most, and mode is, oh my gosh, I just forgot what median mode means. Y'all, I apologize. You ever feel your Adderall wearing off? But give me 1 second. I don't know how to edit these videos, so you're getting live stream right now. Yeah, mode is the center of it. So that does make sense then, doesn't it? I apologize. I just got myself all flipped up, y'all. That makes so much more sense. Please excuse me. Live time, here we are. Nominal, because there is not a numerical significance that actually means anything. We're just kind of randomly assigning numbers to this data to make sense of it. Mode is just the number that occurs the most frequently. So if I'm looking at mode for gender, that means what gender category is most present. Or if I'm looking for mode of ethnicity, that's which of those is most present. I apologize. I got myself all mixed up with these words. So here I am. Ordinal level. Ordinal level is a rank order without specifying the difference between those ranks or the distance between those ranks. So an example of something like that would be class ranking or satisfaction ranking. Let's say that I'm asking someone how satisfied they are with a donut on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being not at all satisfied and 10 being very satisfied. Now, those are, I am ranking things, I am putting things in order from least to most, or something of that capacity. We are ranking them. There is a better and worse component, but the distance between what a 0 and a 1 is, that's not specified. So if someone tells me they are a 4 satisfied with that donut, how is that different than a 5? Because it is different, because we know it's closer to satisfaction, but it's not a specific difference in between those numbers or those numerical rankings. There is meaning we make of it overall, but the specifics between those differentiators is not specified. So class ranking is another one. I'm thinking of some other examples. The pain, that's a good one. I'm stuck on that because I do health psychology. A lot of the times we ask people 0 to 10, what's your pain? 10 being the worst pain imaginable. And people get kind of pissed sometimes and they're like, it's a 13. And I'm like, okay, so I'm going to mark you as a 10 because that means the worst possible pain. But the meaningful difference between a 13 and a 10 or an 8 and a 9 or a 2 and a 1 is so subjective. And there is not a specific way we are measuring that because it's an ordinal level measurement style. So that informs different types of statistics you're going to use. So non-parametric correlations, I don't need you to know what that is, but again, here is information I would like you to know that a Spearman would match with ordinal, and so would a median. And the median is that middle number. So once you order them all from most to least or best to worst or whatever your order is, however we're ranking them, the median is going to be whatever falls in the middle of all of those data points. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the average. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the one that occurs the most, but the middle, median. Interval level are numerical scales with equal intervals, but no true 0. So interval levels are scales that do have meaningful differences in between them, but you can't ever have none. So temperature is a good example. There is a specific leveled measurable difference between 10 degrees and 20 degrees or 10 degrees and 11 degrees. That answer does exist. That is not subjective. There is an objective way we are defining this thing, but there is no 0. You can never have none of it. You can't have no temperature. You can have, I guess you can have a 0 temperature, but that doesn't mean lack of. It doesn't mean it does not exist. That's what I mean by 0 point, lack of existence. It can't not exist. So if it can't not exist, it's always present. Even if we define the differences between those granularities, no true 0 point exists. Same with IQ scores. So you can't, even if you somehow manage to score a 0 on an IQ score, which you can't, by the way, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that doesn't exist. You can't not have an IQ. You have one. You can't not have it. So interval level. This is where we're going to use means, standard deviations, so those averages, and seeing how far things fall apart on average, and Pearson correlations. Then we have our ratio level. So these are numerical scales that do have a true 0. You can have a true absence or lack of that thing, and allows for measurement of those ratios. So things like weight, height, duration of time. You can have a 0. You can have no height. You can be non-existent, right? You can have 0 weight. You can weigh literally nothing. Those things are possible. Duration of time. No time can pass. That is possible. Yeah, ratio levels. I also really like the representation of this. So we have nominal, you kind of see male, female. There's no real number. We assign numbers to it, but that's not like a real part of the expression of that concept. Ordinal measures, so not very important to, goodness gracious, to very important. So we see that there isn't actually any like defined differences between these other than we are ranking them. We are putting them in this kind of subjective order from low to high. Interval measures does not have a 0 point, and ratio measures do. So IQ, you cannot have no IQ. So it's an interval measure. Ratio, the example they use here is income. You are very much capable of making no income. Unfortunately, I am aware of that, right? There we go. Okay. Why does it matter? Why am I making you look at this? I have a whole video about it, so that's another resource I recommend you checking out as you are studying for this. But levels of measurement really, really, really matters. It really matters for research, and it determines what type of statistics you can use. And this is something that young researchers mess up a lot. They'll use whatever type of measurement that is easiest to collect, but then when they go to try to analyze their data, they can't actually answer their question because the statistics they need to answer that question, you can't use it using that type of measurement. So really impactful on what type of results you're going to get. And it informs what type of insight you'll get and how granular, how detailed you can get in the understanding. So making sure you select the most appropriate type is really important, and knowing the limitations and benefits of each is also really important. You have to pick based on your research question so that you can find the most appropriate level of measurement to make it make sense, essentially. This little measure with your heart. I chuckle because that's how I cook, and it's why my cooking is either great or garbage. So, just a little joke, but how you measure actually really does matter quite a bit. So then let's talk about reliability, and then we'll go into validity. Reliability and measurement. Reliability refers to the consistency and stability of measurement across different occasions, items, and observers. It is very important that your measure is reliable so that it can be repeated and it can be accurate. There's a couple of different main ways we test reliability. Reliability, and another way of saying that is basically saying how many times, if you test the same thing, will you get the same result? So theoretically, and we'll go into test retest here, test retest reliability, the way they get at that piece of how reliable is this, how consistent are we measuring this thing, test retest is testing the stability of a measure over time. Let's talk about something like IQ tests. Okay, so IQ tests theoretically are measuring intelligence. I will put a first asterisk in saying that the way they are conceptualizing intelligence a lot of the times, what we actually mean is how well someone can retain information in the way that we teach it in Western societies, which is part of why it's messed up. We're using IQ tests to measure and represent all forms of intelligence because there's a lot of different types of intelligence. And if you tell a fish that it's, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will spend its whole life thinking it's stupid. And that is relevant to the conversation of measurement. All right. So all the way back to say, test and retest in IQ, we want to make sure that it is reliable over time. So if I'm gonna come up with maybe we're gonna say I have a student named John, okay, and John is participating in my research, and I'm trying to make an IQ test. If I give him an IQ test on Monday, and I get a result of 150, when I test him 3 Mondays from now, if I get a result that's 70, well, now my test is not very reliable, is it? I tested and I retested and I got totally different results, meaning that it's not very consistent, it's not very stable in measuring that thing. So if some sort of IQ test is being used regularly, theoretically, it should have really good test retest. So if I ask someone in 7th grade to take an IQ test, if I ask them again in 10th grade, I should be getting just about the same result. That is true for some types of IQ tests, and it's really not true for most types of IQ tests. We know that things in the environment will change that. Not very reliable. Assessment levels. Yeah, let's see. Okay, so internal consistency, that's another type of reliability. This is where we are examining the consistency of results across items within a test. So a reliable measure should yield similar responses to similarly constructed items. The example here is that all items on a scale measuring anxiety should correlate well with each other. Another way of saying that is if I'm going to pick on the IQ test because I said I would, and it's fun for me. So if I am measuring mathematical IQ. How good are you at math? How good are you at mathematical reasoning? And I ask 10 different questions that are all trying to measure your mathematical reasoning, then all 10 of those questions should come up with a pretty similar answer. And they'll do that. If you've ever taken a survey before, you sometimes feel like they're asking you the same question slightly different ways. They are. They're testing for internal consistency. Because if they aren't consistent, we know that that isn't a very reliable measure of that thing. If I'm asking you 10 ways the same thing, but I get totally different results, then my measurement is not very reliable. Internal consistency. It's why things like measurements of psychological anything tend to not just be one question. We don't tend to ask people, how depressed are you? 0 to 10. We ask 10 different questions that are getting at different parts of depression because we want them to all speak to each other and make sure that it's a reliable measurement. Whew, okay, and then we have inner rater reliability. So this is evaluating the extent to which different raters or observers give consistent estimates of the same phenomena. This is really important when we're talking about behavioral observations or qualitative data. So here's some examples of that. We want to make sure that if we are doing research on IQ tests, and maybe this is actually true for children, for IQ test, a normal part of it is to have a teacher give ratings and impressions or a parent. So if we're testing an IQ of a 5-year-old who doesn't have the same language development, we can't give them the test we would give a 25-year-old. So we would ask for observer data, maybe their teacher, how do they show up in school? Maybe their parent, how do they show up at home? Maybe their sibling, how do they show up when parents aren't around? And what we would want is for something to have high relatability, all of those observers need to know exactly what it is we are reporting and making sure that they are consistent so that we can make sure that we are all looking at the same thing. If we ask all these different people about that child's IQ and we get different results, we know that there is some sort of reliability issue going on. Either we are not defining the behavior well enough that people can measure it, or that IQ isn't correct. That's more often than not what happens. If we are working with someone and those behavioral markers don't show up when parents aren't around, but parents are reporting it, that's telling me that our measurement is garbage because that's not actually what we're measuring, which means it's probably not an IQ issue. It's probably got something to do with how they are interacting with the parents, maybe anxiety, maybe stress, maybe pressure, whatever that is. So in order for a measurement to have high inner rater reliability, we need everyone who is doing that measuring to be measuring the same thing pretty much the same way. In qualitative data, when I do an interview with someone and we turn in a transcription, now I have all their words written down in front of me. What we'll do is we'll have at least 2 or 3 different people on the research team look at that qualitative data and code it. So if I have 15 pages worth of transcription of my conversation with someone about their stress, I will go through and I will highlight every part of it that seems like they are talking about a stress behavior. But I'd have 2 other people do it without my influence. So we don't sit there and do it together. They also go through and code everything. And at the end, we come together and we make sure we're all coding the same things the same way, even when we are not impacting each other. So when you are alone, you should be observing this the same way. And that's how we know we have inner rater reliability. If you are doing any sort of research or literature review where you're looking at qualitative research, it will always report inner rater reliability, or it should, because if not, that means it's just one person's opinion and there's no reliability in that measurement. So you should be suspicious. Ooh, okay. How do you test that? How do you test for reliability? There's a lot of different statistical softwares you can use. It depends on the type of reliability test you are doing. Typically, we want to see a 0.70 or above, which is considered to be really highly reliable. That's saying 70% of the time we are sure that it is reliable. That's considered a good reliability standard. We do that for qualitative research as well. At least 70% of the time, we should be coding things the exact same way. You want higher than that, but 70 is like the cutoff for what's considered good. A lot of times 0.5 also works, but that's a different conversation. It can be tricky because patients are different, participants are different, environment is very different. Those things can all impact reliability. If there's a lot of variance in the things we are trying to measure, it makes it harder to operationalize. It makes it harder to make sure that we are reliably testing that thing, especially if environment changes and therefore changes the expression of that thing. Makes it harder. Yeah. Making sure that there's training and really clear protocols. You have to really define everything. You have to really operationalize it. You have to really clearly conceptualize it. That enhances inter-rater reliability. Okay. So then we have validity in measurements. Validity in measurements, a little bit different. Validity is determining whether the test measures what it actually thinks it's measuring. So linking operational definition to the conceptual definition. This is when we are making sure that we are actually drawing accurate inferences from the data. It matters a lot because if our research isn't valid, then it probably doesn't mean too much in real life situation. It probably isn't very credible. It probably isn't very generalizable. We want to make sure we're actually studying and assessing what we think we are doing. So assessing validity, again, there's empirical testing, there's different types of statistics you can do. You can also work with experts, people who are psychometrists, so people who specialize in psychometrics. So yeah, all that sort of thing. Let's talk about the different types of validity though. Types of validity. So how are we testing this? What types of validity can tell us how much we are actually measuring what we think we are measuring? We'll start at face validity, face value, face validity. This measure appears to test what it's supposed to at face value. This is the least strong type of validity. This is definitely the weakest form of validity, but it comes up a lot. So it's important to ensure the acceptance and cooperation for participants. So an example of this would be a depression scale that indicates item clearly related to mood and affect. So if face validity is, if I am measuring depression at face validity, it would make sense if my question just said, how depressed are you? Right? But when we go through some of these other validities, you'll see why that isn't always actually very valid. Face validity is the weakest validity for that reason, because what it means for someone to think they are depressed varies greatly. So if I have one question that says, how depressed are you? One person might interpret that as how clinically depressed am I and look up what the clinical depression standards are and decide off that. One person might be like, ooh, in this moment, I do feel kind of sad. Sadness is not depression. Grief is not depression. People don't know that kind of stuff though, because why would you know that unless you were a psychologist? So making sure that we don't just fully trust face validity just because it makes sense of like, oh yeah, I see where that would measure it. We got to go deeper than that. It is a type of validity though, definitely the weakest. So then we go to content validity. This is the extent to which a measurement represents all of the facets or dimensions of a given construct. So making sure that the test is actually fully measuring the thing that we think it is measuring. So an intelligence test should include lots of different measures of lots of different dimensions of intelligence. That's why if someone tells me they took an IQ test online in 20 minutes, I know that that is not a very valid test because there's no way in hell that you got tested for all of the different dimensions of intelligence accurately in a valid way that quickly. Because there's a lot of different types of intelligence. The ones that are typically included in intelligence tests that we use in schools are things that are intelligence related to how well you do in an academic setting. So that's still just one type of intelligence, but this will include things like problem solving, memory, verbal reasoning, verbal expression, all these different dimensions of the construct of intelligence and however we're defining intelligence. So another example of that content validity if I am measuring something like depression and I want to make sure I have content validity, I have to first understand all the dimensions of depression. So this might be stuff like feeling sad or blue more than often without knowing why. It might also be stuff like lower motivation, feeling like it's harder to get out of bed, feeling like it's harder to get starting on projects or on work. Things like losing interest in stuff you used to be interested in. Things like feeling like you're eating too much or too little, you're sleeping too much or too little. I've looked at all those different dimensions of depression and put that all into the measurement to make sure that I'm really getting a holistic measurement of this thing, making sure that all those dimensions are accurately represented in the measurement. Whew, okay. Convergent validity. Convergent validity is the degree to which two measures of constructs that theoretically should be related are in fact related. They do this a lot when they're testing psychometrics, is they will take one scale that has already been validated. They already know that we are measuring what we think we're measuring, and they'll compare it to the new test. So let's say I am developing a measure for depression. Maybe I use something like the Beck Depression Inventory. That I don't need you to know this, but the Beck Depression Inventory is very well validated. It has very high reliability and validity. That's why we use it a lot. That's why you see those questions a lot of the times. You might not know it, but you would recognize them if you looked up the Beck Depression Scale real quick. And if I'm trying to build a new depression scale, I would have the participant take the Beck depression scale and then take my new depression scale. And if it has good convergent validity, they would both tell me the same outcome of how depressed this person is. So if I'm using a already validated scale and I compare it to my new scale and I get really different results, I can pretty reasonably confer that my scale is not very valid because it's not measuring the same thing that this validated scale is. Make sense? Hope so. Criterion validity. So measures how measures how well one outcome can be predicted from a test score. So there's a couple different types of this. We have concurrent validity and predictive validity. Concurrent validity is a correlation of measure with the criterion at the same time. Whereas predictive validity is a correlation of a measure with a future outcome. So let's back that up and try to give that a little more, let's try to say that in a little more human of a way. Criterion validity is going to see how well the thing you're measuring actually predicts the related outcome. So if I'm measuring something like SAT scores, which are supposed to predict college success, and I want to validate that measurement, what I actually need is not just what are the SAT scores and making sure that they're matching whatever similar measurement. I need to look at the SAT scores and then see how well it actually predicts college success. That's predictive validity, right? Makes sense. The word predictive is in it, which helps when we think about it. And that makes sense when it's a criterion validity, because predictive validity is interested in how well this one outcome of this particular score will be well predictive of the future outcome in question, in this case, college success. Concurrent validity, correlating measure with criterion taken at the same time. So that would be SAT is not a good example of that. Concurrent validity would be something like if I had someone take the I'm trying to remember the acronyms, but is it the ACT that you take to get into college and the SAT at the same time? I would want them to both reasonably predict the same thing from that test out score, concurrent. So at the same time, validity. That's what concurrent literally means. And then we have discriminant validity. This test constructs that should have no relation, test that constructs that should have no relationship do in fact do not have a relationship. So this ensures that measures are not capturing extraneous variables. So remind yourself what that is if you can't, but extraneous variables are variables that might impact our dependent variable without us actually including it in our study. So as a friendly reminder, our variable of interest is the thing that changes. So we're looking at how does this change given all these other circumstances. Extraneous variables are things that are also going to impact that outcome, but you maybe aren't accounting for in your research design. So discriminant validity is interested in seeing that those extraneous variables aren't actually accounting for the outcome more than what you are studying. So an example is measures of anxiety should not correlate with unrelated constructs like physical coordination. So that's really easy to do. In this example with the anxiety piece, I would want to test to make sure that I'm not actually measuring something else. So if I'm making an anxiety test and I ask questions like, do your hands tremble regularly? Do you trip regularly? Do you faint regularly? Do you run into things regularly? All of those things can be an expression of anxiety. If you're anxious enough, that will happen. But if it's actually better capturing something like physical coordination, then it's not fair to say it's anxiety. This happens a lot in stuff like personality testing. So, for example, insurance companies require personality tests in order to get certain types of pain medicine. So, fun fact, that's what I do a lot of the time. That's what I do on Wednesdays, is I do pre-pain evaluations in Department of Anesthesia. And the discriminant validity is garbage, honestly, because we're asking people personality questions, and they might be stuff like, I sometimes tremble for no real reason. And what they're trying to measure in that personality test is anxiety. But when we think about discriminant validity, they're actually measuring something like physical coordination or pain. So some of the questions we ask pain patients, we ask them in a personality test is stuff like, I go to the doctor really frequently. And so they'll say yes. And then they'll get higher scores on things like hypochondria, even though that's not the truth because it has crap discriminant validity. It has to be able to discriminate between extraneous variables and how those are impacting our actual outcome. Yeah, lots of examples of that. It's where you basically answer one thing and it makes it look like one outcome when it's really another. These are kind of tying these pieces together. So if a measure is very reliable but not valid, we're going to keep getting the same or similar results every time we use it very reliably, but it doesn't actually mean it's capturing what you think it's meant capturing. If something is really valid but not reliable, you are not going to get the same responses, but you are going to be capturing the right general thing. You are getting all the dimensions of that construct, but you're not doing it very reliably. For something to be valid and reliable, we are both getting the same results in similar circumstances, and we have evidence that we are actually measuring what we think we are measuring. So you really want a measurement to be both valid and reliable for it to mean anything for long-term outcomes. But it can be challenging. We've talked about a lot of these things already, but I like to kind of loop them all together. So I'm going to bop all over the place here. We've talked about operationalization, how that is just incredibly fundamental to measuring, to designing research, how it is very important. It is also hard. It is a challenge. It's a lot harder than people usually think it is at first glance. I bet you anything that most of you, when you turn in your midterm for me, and I'm asking you to define your research question and operationalize it, what are our actual constructs? How are we conceptualizing this? You'll get feedback from me that we need to go deeper. This is why operationalizing is really difficult. Conceptualizing is really difficult. Another big part of the challenge in behavioral research is that it's subjectivity. Human behavior is influenced by so many things, both external and internal, and it makes it really hard to measure something consistently. What pain is different to everyone. It is so subjective. It is so person to person. There is not an objective truth, a real correct answer. And that is true of so many things in behavioral science. What is happiness? What is anxiety? What is stress? What is a good outcome? What is functioning? What is not functioning? What is weird? What is atypical? All that crap. Subjective. And emotional responses are highly individualized and context dependent. So if I ask someone to take a depression scale for me at the start of a doctor's visit, and they are really stressed out about that doctor's visit, they might rate themselves as way higher in depression than they would 2 weeks later when they get the results that their test came back negative. And so now they're not as stressed anymore. And so now they're not marking as high of depression. So we have some validity issues because we're actually measuring stress instead of depression. And it's so subjective. And what it means to be depressed or what it means to be anxious can fluctuate so much so quickly. So subjectivity is just really the big challenge in all of this in behavioral sciences, which is why it's so important to conceptualize and operationalize really strongly. Variability. So behavioral responses are not static. They don't stay the same. They can change even within the same individual. And that makes long-term studies really, really difficult. If I want to look at something like health over time, maybe I want to look at cardiac health over time, and I follow the same 100 people over 30 years. Every 5 years, they fill out a survey for me and they tell me all about their cardiac health. The trouble is that they will act really differently at some points in their life. Maybe when I first ask them questions, they're working out really regularly. But when I ask them questions 15 years later, they have 2 kids and they haven't worked out in 10 years, right? So I am looking at cardiac health, but I can't tell a lot about genetic predisposition because their behaviors are so different over time, even within the same person. Things will change over time. So even if I can say, okay, I took 5,000 people and I measured their religiosity, that will change in 5 years. So that research finding is really only relevant in that little snapshot of time because shit changes. So variability is part of why I'm going to get on to y'all about you can't use super old research for a lot of the topics that we talk about in behavioral sciences because things change so much. There's also a lot of cultural differences, right? Up here at the top, behaviors and attitudes are often very culturally bound, and that causes a lot of challenges for measurement. It's good. We love cultural differences, but it means that as researchers, we need to really be on our game. So the example is social norms influence expression of symptoms and mental health assessments. Here's a good example. I use the word anxiety. Some people say my nerves are acting up. My mom says my stomach is gurgly, right? So I have a friend who calls them the shits whenever they're anxious. Some people say I'm tense. Some people say I'm just not acting right. Some people are saying, oh, I'm just feeling in my head. There's so many ways to say the same thing, and culture really, 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 really matters for that. So I'm asking everyone from a white cultural lens of do you feel anxious? But someone doesn't conceptualize what I conceptualize as anxiety with the word anxiety, then I'm not actually measuring what I think I'm measuring. And it's both conceptualization, operationalization, and you have to be really careful with cultural differences. So a lot, and I mean a lot of the measurements we use that are psychometrically validated are only validated for white Western educated women who are usually in Psych 100 classes at a university because they're the people we can get to take out and fill out our surveys. So that same scale, even though it's validated, the Beck Depression Scale, even though it's validated, everyone uses it, the government uses, we love the Beck Depression Scale. It is not very culturally sensitive to other groups of people who aren't white Western educated, usually women, who are in a Psych 100 class, which means that they're not like actually that great at measurements because culture really matters with how we conceptualize things. Observer bias. So this is when, if you know you are being watched, we act differently. It's just the truth. There's some really interesting research on it, but observer bias really matters, especially in behavioral science. We talked about this when we talked about things like deception and lying and informed consent and the ethics that go into that. But there are some research questions that the presence or expectations of the like the researchers themselves, can really influence participant behaviors, known as the observer effect. So if I am working with someone, I'm collecting data on their depression, but instead of giving them a survey to fill it out, I am asking them the questions one by one. Maybe they don't like me. Maybe they don't trust me. Maybe they don't feel comfortable. We don't have rapport. They're probably going to respond differently than if they responded on their own. Sometimes when I'm doing personality assessments as a pre-pain, assessment in medical settings, if someone has literacy issues or if someone needs it translated into a different language or something, I will have to sit there and read the questions to them. And it's so biased. The outcome is so biased because I know when I ask you 20 seconds into meeting you about your sex life and how satisfied you are with it, people are uncomfortable and people don't want to tell me, some random resident, about their sex life after not knowing me. So we're probably going to have some observer bias in that particular piece of it. Challenges in measuring. So then what do we do with all this? How do we decide what to do? How do we decide what to measure? How do I choose a measurement? More often than not, at our state, we're talking here in the intro, research methods, undergrad level, you want to pick an existing measure. Even with all these faults, it is so much easier to pick a measure that has already been psychometrically validated and has been found reliable. You don't have to do all that stats yourself. You don't need to think about the wording of all the questions. You don't have to worry about all this stuff. You still should a little bit, but choosing an existing measurement tends to be the easier way to go if it is reasonable, if the measurement is reasonable for your population. Advantages is it's time efficient. It takes so much time and money and effort and know-how to build and validate and reliably test a measure. I mean, people specialize in that. That's people's whole jobs. And it's really not something you want to take on as a small undertaking. It's a very big responsibility. So it's really helpful to already have that proven reliability and validity. And it helps you compare between previous studies. So if you want to do something where you're studying depression and you want to compare that to what other studies have found about people with depression, you got to make sure you're measuring depression the same way, or at least a very close way. So if everyone's using the same measurement, it makes it easier to compare between studies. That being said, they're not always very appropriate, especially depending on your population. I tend to research and conduct research with populations that are underrepresented, are more marginalized. I work a lot with sexual and gender minorities, and the measures are usually not validated for them. And so that is really important. It is a really big barrier in research. I spend a lot of time trying to find measurements that have been validated with the population I'm working with. And a lot of times it doesn't exist. And so that just is a limitation of a lot of research. You want to make sure you look at the latest literature to make sure that the measurement you are selecting isn't garbage. What are other people saying about it? And you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Google Scholar, which we've talked about, is the way I usually find most assessments. I'll literally just type in like anxiety measure, valid, and then my population, so sexual and gender minorities, and then see what comes up. See what other work someone has already done. I want to find someone else who's already done all the statistics on it, and then I use the measurement. There's also a resource I have linked here called PsycTest, which is through the American Psychological Association, and it is a massive, massive database of psychological measurements and assessments that have been validated. And that's great. It can kind of be a pain in the butt to access, though. You usually have to do it through the university, so you have to log in with your credentials from the university you're at before you can get access. It's worth it. It took me like half an hour to set up, though. I wish I had an easier way to tell you about it. But PsycTest is a great place to start, but I usually end up actually pulling it off Google Scholar just because it's easier. You can create your own measurement though, not in the context of this course, but theoretically, lots of people do create their own measurements. It can be really helpful because you can make it custom. It will fit your research questions, your context, your population. You can make it relevant to you in your study, which is awesome because that's the exact barrier of using an old one. It's innovative. So we can talk about new dimensions or constructs, expand our understanding of things, and there's more control so that you can make it match your population a little bit better. But again, it takes a whole lot of work, takes a whole lot of know-how. It usually requires money, and there's a lot of ethical responsibility that goes into it because it really, really, really matters. It really impacts research, and research gives us what we call facts, and then facts are what we make decisions off of, at least most of the time or some of the time. So really important, very resource intensive. Most people aren't able to do this. That being said, there are some basic principles for developing a new measurement. The first is you're going to really clearly conceptualize your concepts, all the dimensions of those concepts, all the indicators of those concepts. You want to test for validity. You want to test for reliability. You want to pilot test it, meaning you don't just create a measure and then go, "Oop, good to go." You have to take that measure and you have to get a whole lot of people and a whole lot of data. So if I'm building a depression measure, I have to get a whole lot of people to take it so I can run the tests on it and make sure it's reliable and valid. I usually have to have that same group of people take it again or have another group of people take it so I can compare. It takes a lot of time to do something like that. The pilot testing is a big part of the lift in building a new measure or something similar. Yeah, that's about it. Okay. And this is our last slide. So implementation challenges. It's not even just the measure you pick or how you make it. It's also how you use the measurement. We'll talk about this more when we talk about survey stuff later too, but the two big words here are reactivity and demand characteristics. Reactivity is a phenomena where participants alter their behavior due to the awareness that they're being observed. So this doesn't always even mean that someone is literally observing you. It can also be like, I'm filling out this survey and I know that someone's going to look at it. So I want to manage my impression. I don't want to, if I'm going into a job interview, for example, and they make me fill out a personality assessment because they do that kind of stuff now. I'm probably going to play up my good qualities and play down my bad qualities because I'm reacting to what they're wanting me to do. That's also kind of getting into demand characteristics, which is where there's cues in the environment to give participants hint as to what is expected or desired. That's also a really big part of it. If I know you want me to answer a certain way, I'm more inclined to do that. Yeah, so with reactivity, where people are altering their behavior due to awareness being observed, some things like automatic data collection, so things like surveys where they can take them at home, there's still that demand characteristic to some extent, but it's less reactivity, making sure that it is as unobtrusible as possible. It's why we use stuff like double-sided mirrors or like cameras nowadays to record people when they're participating in research rather than the observer literally sitting in the room with a little clipboard, a little less reactive. Demand characteristics, like I said, are cues in the environment research that are kind of like leading someone to a certain answer. It's the difference between saying, you're not depressed, are you? Versus, have you thought about killing yourself? Those are different. Saying like, you're not thinking about killing yourself, you're not depressed. You can tell the answer I want. You can tell I'm scared. And you're like, you're not, right? And so it kind of begs the response of like, no, not me. It's leading. Whereas you can be intentional with how you ask questions matter. The wording of questions matters. You can also, depending on the research context, use things like misdirection or disguise, deception. It depends on the exact question and what you need to make sure that people aren't being led to a certain answer. In order to best practice some of this, you want to collect data in the most consistent environment as possible. So if I'm collecting data on depression. I don't want to ask half of the people to go home and take a survey and half of the people I read the questions to. Those are different testing environments and you will probably get different results. You want to have very, very clear instructions. Don't leave any room for misinterpretation. Make sure that all the participants have very clearly defined rules and guidelines to try to mitigate things that can go wrong or increase things like validity issues. The blind design utilization, this is where people don't know what condition they're in. This is used a lot in things like medical research. So if we are testing a new depression pill and we're going to give half the people a placebo, like a sugar pill, and half the people the real new depression medicine, one of the ways we can help with this is the doctors prescribing it don't even know which one is which. Only the researchers know which one is which, so that the doctors have much less ability to lead people to a specific answer. And the participants also don't know which side they're in. We'll talk about it when we talk about experimental design. And we find that making sure that responses are anonymous and confidential tend to make people be more honest, which makes sense. If I ask a bunch of people about their depression and then I'm going to post it all on social media with their names attached to it, probably going to get different results than if I ask that same group of people to fill out my depression survey and no one will ever know their responses except for me, and I don't even know the responses because I turn their names into numbers and I use numbers when I actually look at the data, right? Tends to be a little more honest. All of that makes sense, right? And to tie all that into one big example of something like IQ testing, there's so much evidence that we are not actually measuring what we think we're measuring. We are really only measuring one very specific dimension of intelligence. And we're not even really doing it that reliably. If we test retest is usually pretty bad with that sort of thing. If we ask someone to take a test when they're 20 versus 25, we don't always get the same results. There are some tests that are better than others at that, but again, what are we actually measuring doesn't matter. They're designed for a certain group of people. The people who have been in the pilot testing, the people that they did the validity testing with, tends to be pretty valid, but for everyone else who uses different language or has different cultural lens or has different dimensions of intelligence, people can walk away from IQ testing feeling like they have low intelligence when that's actually bullshit. And it causes a lot of damage and can cause a lot of harm for a lot of different reasons. So I'm not saying let's throw out IQ testing entirely, but I'm saying let's seriously reconsider it. And it's a pretty powerful example with a lot of this stuff. So, all right, y'all, that's what I got for you today, and I will see you next time.